President, I ask consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you. I ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this week the Senate is voting on 5 of the President's nominations for membership on the National Labor Relations Board. I expect all 5 to receive up or down votes, as they generally do, and I expect all 5 to be confirmed. And the board will then have a full complement with a Democratic majority of 3 and two Republican members. I'd like to review for a moment what has happened and how we got to this spot, because it's an important moment in the history of our ability as a country to maintain a check and balances and a certain separation of power among the various branches of government, and especially to restrain the executive, which has been an important part of our country's history. In January of 2012, the President nominated 2 individuals to be members of the National Labor Relations Board using his recess appointment power. He has that power in the Constitution. The only problem was the Senate wasn't in recess. At least that was our view. The Senate was in a 3-day pro forma session. A 3-day pro forma session is a device that was invented by Senator Reid, the distinguished majority leader, when President Bush was president. And he did it to keep President Bush from using his recess appointment power when the Senate was in recess. President Bush didn't like that. Most of our presidents have chafed under the restraints that we have placed upon our executive, but he respected it. And President Bush never made recess appointments while the Senate was in session. But President Obama did on January 4th, 2012. Republicans objected strongly to that. And after a great deal of discussion, we helped to bring a lawsuit. That lawsuit went before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with our position, said in effect that the President could not make a recess appointment when the Senate itself had determined that it was in session. And since then, there have been 2 other decisions by other courts of appeals that have said that what the President did on January 4th, 2012 was unconstitutional. That will come before the Supreme Court this next term. No one knows what decision the Supreme Court will make, but my sense would be that the Supreme Court will say to this president or to any president that, Mr. President, you can't use your constitutional power to make a recess appointment at a time when the Senate's not in recess. Now, I said earlier that presidents have chafed under these restraints on the executive branch. That's been true ever since the days of George Washington. George Washington imposed his own modesty and restraint upon the American character when he resigned his commission after the Revolutionary War, when he stepped down after 2 terms as president and went back to Mount Vernon, when he asked to be called Mr. President instead of Your Excellency. Ever since then, we've had many strong presidents, and they haven't liked the idea that Washington also helped write a constitution that created a Congress and a Bill of Rights. And the whole purpose of that was to restrain the executive. After all, our revolution was against a king. And most of our founders, not all of them, but most of them, and the ones that had a majority at the Constitution, didn't want a king of the United States. They wanted a president of the United States. And one of the most important checks upon the power of the executive is the Senate's power to advise and consent, the power to review about 1,000 presidential nominations that come to us, and it takes a while. Sometimes it takes longer than the nominees think. I've repeated many times on this floor when President Bush I nominated me to be Education Secretary, and the senator from Ohio held up my nomination for 3 months. I didn't think that was such a good idea, but the Senate had the power to do it because the Constitution restrains the executive. Unfortunately, this president didn't seem to read that chapter in American history, because we've seen during this president's time repeated efforts to circumvent the constitutional checks on the executive. This administration has appointed more czars than the Romanovs had. That's the way you get around the appropriations process. This administration's excellent education secretary has used a simple waiver authority, in effect, to create a national school board. When Congress says we don't want to appropriate money to implement Obamacare, the health secretary says, well, if Congress won't do it, I'll do it anyway. I'll just go out and raise some private money and do it. And then we have recess appointments being made when the Senate's not in recess. That's unconstitutional. I mean, if that could happen, the Senate could adjourn for lunch and come back and we'd have a new Supreme Court justice because the president said we were in recess. So what's happening this week with these National Labor Relations Board nominees has a special significance in our constitutional history. Because not only did Republicans bring a lawsuit, which we're winning, in 3 courts, we brought it in 1, the case has been won in 3 different federal courts, but the president, after much discussion, has withdrawn his 2 illegally appointed nominees. I suggested that he do this in May, when we had a markup of the 5 nominees that the president sent. I voted for 3, the Democratic chairman and the 2 Republicans, and I voted against the 2 who were illegally appointed. They're well-qualified people. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that the Senate needed a way to express its objection to this unconstitutional action by the executive. And I suggested that what the president should do is withdraw those 2 nominees and send us 2 new ones in the normal process. People who had not stayed on after the federal court had decided they were unconstitutionally there. These 2 unconstitutionally appointed nominees, Mr. President, have decided more than 1,000 cases. They're all subject to being vacated because there was no constitutional quorum. It leaves quite a mess in our labor laws. But the president withdrew those 2. And now we are this week doing what the Senate normally does. We are considering in the normal process his new nominees. Now, I'm voting, as I said, for the 2 Republicans and the chairman. The chairman was not illegally appointed, and he did not continue to serve as an illegally appointed person since he wasn't illegally appointed, so I voted for him. I don't agree with the chairman in his view of labor laws, but I'll have to take that up at the next election. You know, elections have consequences. And when we elect a president of the United States, he normally appoints people who agree with him. I'm also voting for having an up or down vote. We almost always do that with the president's nominees. There have only been a few times in our history when we have not. We've never failed to have an up or down vote on a Supreme Court justice after they've come to the floor. Never failed to have an up or down vote on a district court judge after they've come to the floor. And the same in terms of circuit courts, we never did until Democrats started filibustering President Bush's judges about 10 years ago when I came to the Senate. We all know that story. But normally we have an up or down vote, and we'll be doing that this week on the president's 5 nominees. I am voting against 2 of the nominees when that up and down vote comes, and I want to explain why. One is Mr. Hirasawa, and one is Ms. Schiffer. Both of them have excellent legal backgrounds. The problem is, I'm not persuaded, and I hope I'll be proven wrong, that they're able to transfer their positions of advocacy to positions of judge, that they can be impartial when employers come before them. Employers as well as employees have a right when they come before the National Labor Relations Board to expect that all 5 judges, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, from whatever background they might have come, will look at the case and decide it in an impartial way. It may be possible that Mr. Hirasawa and Ms. Schiffer can do that, but I'm not persuaded that's true, and so while I'm voting that they have up or down votes, I'm not voting for them. The president has nominated 3 different individuals who were employed directly by major labor unions for the board. First was Craig Becker, who was counsel for 2 unions, whose nomination was rejected by a bipartisan vote in 2010. Second one was Mr. Griffin. The third one was Ms. Schiffer. I asked Ms. Schiffer if she could remember, I asked at the hearing, with other examples of an administration stocking the NLRB with organized labor employees, and she couldn't think of examples, and I couldn't think of it either. Over the last several years, the NLRB seems to have veered away from impartiality. Instead of preserving a level playing field and protecting the carefully balanced rights of all parties, it has shown favoritism toward organized labor leadership and little interest in the rights of employees or individual employees who want to exercise their rights not to join a union. Now, in fairness, I'll have to admit that this politicization of the NLRB has occurred both in Republican administrations and in Democratic administrations. But I think appointing a person directly from a major job with a major labor union is not an example of trying to move away from that trend. The trend is causing confusion. One labor law professor at a nationally recognized law school recently said she can't even use her labor law textbook anymore. She has to resort to handing out NLRB decisions to explain the law. They're changing it so much. The NLRB's ventured into new rulemaking authority, both of which have been stalled by the federal courts. In August 2011, the board issued a new rule requiring employers to post a biased employees' rights poster in the workplace and making it an unfair labor practice to fail to do so. 2 separate federal courts have struck the rule down because it exceeded statutory authority. Then in December 2011, the board issued a new rule shortening the time in which a union election is held, otherwise known as the ambush election rule. The D.C. court struck down this rule on the grounds it lacked a quorum, and then NLRB is appealing the decision. So far, this administration's NLRB has sought to change the rules for determining bargaining rights, for determining the process for certifying a representation election petition, for determining the legal obligation of employers to withhold dues from employees' paychecks even when there's no valid collective bargaining agreement in place, for determining the validity of arbitration provisions in employment contracts, the legality of numerous well-intentioned employee handbook provisions, the rules governing employee discipline when there is no valid collective bargaining agreement in place, the rules governing the confidentiality of employee witness statements given during a legitimate investigation, determining a new policy forcing non-union member employees to pay for union lobbying expenses, determining the rules governing employers' rights to limit access to their property, and attempting to create an entirely new employer obligation and unfair labor practice through the poster requirement struck down by multiple federal appellate courts. The effect of all of these, Mr. President, seems to me to tilt the playing field in favor of organized labor instead of impartiality, which is the directive of the statute. So fairness and impartiality is what I'm looking for in any NLRB nominee. 2 of the nominees do not pass this test for me. That's why I plan to oppose their nominations. But the most important message from this week's debate is this. The United States Senate is saying to not just this president, but to any president, Republican or Democratic, that you may not abuse your constitutional right of recess appointments by making appointments when the Senate itself determines that it is not in recess. To do so is an affront to the separation of powers. It undermines the check and balances that were placed upon the executive at the beginning of our country as a way of preserving our liberties. That's an important step in the history of constitutional law in this country, and I'm glad to see that it has been done in this way. I thank the President, and I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.